You might say that the real question here is not whether God exists. You might say that the real question is whether God's existence can be established through reason. That is, can you come up with a demonstration, an argument of some sort, which establishes that there is such a being that we recognize as sort of described by our traditional notions of God. Blackburn, trying to do his reader's service in this introduction to the basic questions of philosophy, covers what are probably generally considered to be the three most prominent attempts to do this, attempts to establish God's existence through reason. The first, the so-called Ontological Argument, which was first thought up by St. Anselm, whom I believe lived in I'm going to say the 12th century, actually 11th century, but that's a guess. The second, the so-called Cosmological Argument, which was developed by Thomas Aquinas in, I think, the 13th century. And also another argument that was offered by Aquinas, but has come in different versions from different thinkers at different times, and is probably the argument that is most commonly called upon still today, and that's the argument from design. So these three ways of thinking about not so much whether God exists, because some people would say that is ultimately a mystery, and I would say most of the religious people I know would acknowledge that it's entirely reasonable that God exists, but that it's not entirely a matter of reason. That there's something fundamentally mysterious about belief in God, and that has to do with faith, which is a different sort of knowledge, what we know through faith, and traditionally thought of, for instance, in the Catholic tradition, really been worked out very beautifully by certain thinkers, like most prominently Thomas Aquinas. But these are attempts to establish God's existence through reason alone. And to some people that may seem like a rather sterile exercise, but I think it is important. That is, to discover for oneself, whether you believe in God or not, what the arguments are, and what the arguments are, whether there's a reasonable basis for belief, and whether it can actually be established in any kind of definitive way. I won't try to go through these arguments in detail. It's really up to you to read it. But I will say a few things about these arguments. And the first argument, Anselm's so-called Ontological Argument, is notoriously difficult. I can't even tell you for sure, why it's called the Ontological Argument. Ontology means being, and ontological means having to do with being. So the best I can make out is that the argument starts with the conception of God, and the certain conception of God, and argues that very conception of God leads one to believe that God actually exists in reality. That is, that he has being, not just as an idea, but an independent, real existence or being. That's my understanding of it. I could be wrong, probably wrong, but that's the way I think of it. But why it's called the Ontological Argument, of course, is not as important as what the Ontological Argument is. Again, it's a fairly difficult argument, notoriously sort of contentious argument. You can see the gist of it on page 154, and it goes something like this. That is, you and I and everyone can imagine a being greater than which no other being exists. Not so much a perfect being, put that aside for the moment, but a being greater than which no other being exists. We can conceive of that at least as an idea, and when we conceive of it as a concept or idea, it has an existence in our minds as a concept or idea. So we can conceive of it. We hold it that this is what Anselm claims, at least, is it's a fully coherent concept of a being greater than which no other exists. And that is an idea, again, we can hold in our minds. And then the question is whether that being exists just as an idea in our mind, without anything in reality to answer to it, or whether it both exists in the mind as an idea and as a real thing in the world independent of our idea. Well, Anselm says, say that it only exists in the mind as an idea and does not exist in reality, independent of our minds. If we say that, then we say, well, we can, that the idea that we hold in our minds exists only as an idea and does not exist in reality. But we can conceive of a being which greater than which no other being can be thought, which exists both as an idea in our mind and as an independently existing in reality, and that would be better because it existed in reality and not just in mind than an original idea. But our original idea was of a being greater than which no other exists. So we were thinking both of a being greater than which no other exists and a being greater than which something does exist. That is the second idea. So what the basic idea, and there's a hell of a lot more to it than that. But the basic idea is that if we can conceive of this being greater than which no other being exists, and we then say that it exists only as an idea in our minds, then we are led into self-contradiction. That is, then we are led to admit that we were both conceiving of a being greater than which no other exists and a being greater than which something does exist. And that leads into contradiction. So we're then, according to this argument, then forced to accept the alternative that the concept of the being greater than which no other exists also exists in reality, independent of our conception of it, that exists both as an idea in our understanding and as an independent reality or being in the world. That's the simple version, and it's my version. And I'm not an expert on the ontological argument, which is a devilishly difficult and subtle argument, and there's a lot of different interpretations of it, or a lot of different ideas of how it should be interpreted. Helpfully, Blackburn does include the classic criticism, which was made by a contemporary of Anselm, a monk named Gonolo, who said that by this way of thinking, then everything that exists in the mind that we say is the greatest must also exist in reality. That is, if we think of his example was, I can conceive of an island more perfect than any other island. And it would seem that by Anselm's reasoning, we are led to believe that island must exist, because if it didn't exist, it wouldn't be the greatest island, or the island greater than which no other island can be thought. That's a famous counter-argument, or at least a short version of a counter-argument to the ontological argument. Of course, Anselm then answered Gonolo, and it's all available, and it's very, very interesting. So that's called by Blackburn an a priori argument. That is, you don't actually, the argument doesn't depend upon our experience of the world in any way. The argument just proceeds from the idea, the very idea of a being greater than which no other can be thought, which is commonly thought to be an attribute of God. And on the basis of that idea alone, from the logical implications of that idea, is led to conclude that God must exist in reality. That is, a priori, prior to an experience. We don't actually look to our experience of the world. We argue straight from the concept or idea. The second argument he looks at, the cosmological argument, is what is commonly thought to be distinct from an a priori argument as an a posteriori argument. A posteriori meaning after experience, or from experience is Latin. I'm not exactly sure what the exact translation is, but the a priori is prior to all experience or apart from all experience. But a posteriori is arguing from experience, and depending upon our knowledge of the world. Aquinas has a different way of arguing, the so-called cosmological argument, arguing from the order of the world. That is, if we look at the world around us, we are led, according to Aquinas, logically led, inescapably led to the conclusion that God must exist in some form. And the general version of the cosmological argument that he gives here is the argument from a first cause. We believe that everything in the universe is caused by something else, and must be caused by something else. That is, if an event in the universe happens, it happens because it was caused. Some reminiscent of what we were discussing earlier, the question of determinism. Well, of course, any event in the universe is caused by previous events in the universe, and those events are themselves caused by previous events, and so on and so on. And we realize that we can trace the line of causality back and back and back. And the question is, does it go on forever? That is either this string or connection or line of causes goes back forever and there's no beginning, or there must be a beginning, a first cause. Of those two alternatives, which one is the more reasonable? Well, Aquinas says that if you can't argue back to an infinite regress, that is, that for various metaphysical reasons, and Blackburn talks about the one being, if there isn't a first cause, if there isn't something that actually begins the chain of causation, then the question is why anything exists at all, rather than nothing. So either you have to sort of be content with saying, well, the line of causation, the chain of causes stretches back infinitely with no first cause, or you have to say that there was a first cause. Aquinas opts for the latter. That is, there must be, the world must have a beginning. The events of the world must be initiated by a first event or a first cause. Of course, that first cause would have to be something which itself was not caused by anything else, elsewise it wouldn't be the first cause. So it must be something that caused itself. And Aquinas believes that, well, this we all recognize to be God. That is something which is a necessary being, a being that is not caused by something else, does not owe its existence to something else, for instance, the way that you and I do, but was a being that had to exist, that must exist, and was its own cause. This we all recognize to be God, the idea of God as the first mover or first cause, which is actually an idea of God or a demonstration of God that was suggested in very sort of sketchy form by Aristotle 1,000 years, 1,200 years before, 2,000 years before Aquinas. The last argument that he looks at is the so-called argument from design, and that's the one that perhaps is, well, at least on the surface, the easiest to understand. It's the notion that just as Aquinas looked at the world in a certain way in terms of things causing each other, and reasoned back to the existence of God as the necessary first cause of everything in the universe, the argument from design looks upon the world and notices that it is an orderly place. There is cosmos, or order, in the world, especially to our modern eyes, really, the way this argument has gone the past 200 or 300 years, the natural world, the world of living things. We look at a living thing, an organism of any sort, and it looks like, to our eyes, although it's clearly not something that was made by human beings, it has a complexity, a way in which the different parts of an organism fit together in such a way that a living thing looks like it was fashioned or designed or created with especially the way the different parts fit together with a certain purposes in mind. That is, organisms, living things, do not look like they're randomly accumulated things. They look like they're designed. They look like, the famous example is William Paley, 19th century naturalist and theologian, wrote a book called Natural Theology, in which he argued that, if we come across a watch on a deserted beach, it exhibits certain characteristics which set it apart from the natural things around it, let's say a rock or a grain of sand. And that just as we would look at that watch, and even though we knew nothing about it, we would reason to the idea that it was created or fashioned. So we look at the natural world in general, high level of complexity, and we reason that it too was designed, living things especially, and created. But here we have, of course, a grand or divine creator.